Hi, and welcome to another session of the Game Mechanics. Today, I'm super excited and very honored to have Whitney here with us. Whitney Beltrán is, God, I met you. You don't look anywhere old enough to be as long ago as I met you.
Well, thank you.
That's like basically the truth. And we were working. Actually, it was on you were working with a team doing kind of a web narrative platform, and they asked for a property that I had worked on that we never published, which was this weird kind of Alexander Dumas in Egypt with Napoleon thing I'd written. And
Hmm.
you took that garbage and made something really good out of it.
Well, I appreciate that.
I think that's actually the only time we quasi work together. But we've become good friends over the years, and I've watched your career go on to just amazing things. Give us a little background on you, and then we'll talk about designing narrative games.
Absolutely. So, hi, everybody. My name is Whitney Beltrán. I am a narrative designer and writer for games. I've been doing that for more than 13 years now. I started at a little company called Eline Media, making the game Beyond Blue. I became narrative director at Hidden Path Entertainment, where we worked on a AAA Dungeons and Dragons RPG. I then went on to be the studio head of my own studio, focused on making games for India first. And now I am with CDPR as a senior quest designer. So back to principal work, which makes me very happy because I like being creative. Maybe making the line go up on spreadsheets is not the best use of it.
No, but making characters and stories that make people feel and cry and laugh.
Yes, making people cry, that's what I'm here for. Make them cry.
Yeah, you do just a beautiful job with that. And so let's dive right in. So today's subject is narrative design principles, and I think let's start by maybe doing a little definition. What do you feel is the right way to frame up narrative design versus game writing? Because I think a lot of people, they just merge that. They assume it's really the same thing. Can you
Yeah,
break that down for us?
absolutely. So I think it's important to realize in the industry, the standard is that there is no standard. Those terms are used interchangeably at a number of different studios to mean different things. So when we talk about narrative design today, what we're really talking about is design thinking, how things work, what's going on underneath the hood, about when lines are delivered, or how we decide what part of the story plays, or even just like how do we make the music go off at the right time to make you feel like this narrative moment is important, right? It's the whole system. It's very holistic. Whereas games writing is much more straightforward. It's what text, what dialogue is going in the game. And so I really view game writing as a subset skill of an overall narrative design skill. Now, it's true in the industry, there are people who are just game writers. They only write game dialogue or text or lore. But that's usually at very large AAA studios where everybody's kind of a socket and a widget. And they're very, very few and far between. So it's incredibly competitive. It's much better to have a more holistic background to understand game design in general, but especially narrative design because it's going to open more doors for you if you can, prototype your dialogue system in blueprints or understand how, a boss combat encounter is going to work with what you're doing on the narrative side. It's all connected. And so you'll have a much better, more fighting chance to get a place of foothold in this industry if you have those broader skills and understandings.
Yeah, and I think that's very true. I want to push a little further because I think a lot of, to me, and I agree, the terms are imprecise, but I prefer the kind of framing where if you think about like narrative design is the structure of your game into which then game writing fits, right?
Yeah.
It's how you are going to serve up that writing, how impactful is that writing going to be? Meaning not the quality of the writing, but how much gameplay delta affects is it comes out of the choices that the player makes through the dialogue. Well, your framework, the kind of design structure for your for your narrative structure has to allow for that, has to build those
Yeah.
affordances in. And so a lot of our perspective here on the game mechanics is helping people create their own games, right? So it's not so much about career path, but it is your own act of creation.
Hmm.
So when you think about narrative design structure and you're thinking about, oh, a person's going to go make their own game or a small team's going to make a game, real indie project, and what would be your kind of like first thoughts about some advice on the
Yeah.
actual design structure?
So, if we blow this all the way up, what narrative design is at its core is meaning design. Narrative design is what give games meaning, emotional meaning, story meaning, intellectual meaning. So it actually is a really, really important discipline to master. And it starts by with just being aware of the fact that you are intentionally creating meaning and examining what meaning am I creating? When I do this mechanic, is there a value attached to this mechanic? For instance, if like this is supposed to be like a cozy, Harvest Moon game, but we have a gun in it, right? Like those mechanics are fighting against the narrative. We call that ludonarrative dissonance, and they're not meshing together. So when we say that it's holistic and we're delivering meaning, you have to examine each piece of what you're designing to see if it's resonant with all the other pieces, to create something creatively cohesive.
Yeah, I love the phrase meaning, and I think you have to think about how do we reflect the player's actions? How does it become meaningful, right? And that things like, am I using statistics to track? Am I building relationships? Am I tracking those? And those then affect narrative you're getting, right? Is there all games have different types of currencies. They don't necessarily refer to them as currencies, but how does your interactions with characters in that narrative structure the kinds of changes, the kinds of meaning and impact you can have in the game itself? And a lot of what we're talking about is kind of like story as gameplay context, right?
Hmm.
I mean, I think that there's a really broad spectrum of what narrative gaming means, but I do think it's not where, oh, there's gameplay then there's story, right?
No,
That's
no.
that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about story as gameplay and gameplay impacting story, right? That kind of synergistic meshing of the gears between gameplay and story generation.
Absolutely. And I think there's a great example really quickly to pick out of what you just said in terms of like relationship mechanics and maybe statistically keeping track of how much a character likes you or dislikes you. Depending on how you structure that economy, right, as a designer, you are saying things about how relationships work in your game. Are they transactional, right? Did you design it transactionally? Are they more holistic? Are they backwards in some way? There's so much power in playing with what you're doing mechanics wise to render meaning. Don't just like no thought it. Think about what you are saying when you say, well, this relationship is transactional in nature because of how I'm structuring it at a design level. It's going to feel like that when players play it. Did you intend that or did you not intend that?
Yeah, good point. And I think, and I think tracking of things with data and being able to then reflect narrative in that is really important. And then other kinds of structures um, that we can reflect in gameplays. What are some of your favorite when you're thinking about kind of smaller indie games? What are some examples you go to and thinking about? Oh, that was a really good structure for how story and gameplay interwove to it. Anything come to mind?
I mean, I love good, simple, straightforward world state tracking. When players play games, what they really love is when the game sees them. When the game sees their choices or sees the personality they're presenting or remembers something that they did that they feel like they were inhabiting an identity, right? And the much that we can reward that with a system world state, you did that thing, so we're going to respond with that thing. Man, players love that. That's like the easiest win, in my opinion.
Uh-huh. Well, and it's something we've talked a bunch on the series, which is that feedback loop, right?
Hmm.
Being able to, as you say, that the game and the characters in the game see you, recognize you, and that the world reacts to you. Some of the examples we've discussed, which I love, is in the Game of Thrones um, game that Telltale's did. There was a great line, talking to Cersei, and it just Cersei's will remember this, right? And my hairs on my neck stood up, like, oh. And then, hours and hours later, it was really disappointing because she didn't,
Yes.
right? And so it was like such a great starting point, but then they didn't track it, they didn't pay it off,
Mhm.
and so you have to be careful. Don't set expectations you can't fulfill, right?
Yes.
And that kind of thing. But when you can fulfill it. It's incredibly powerful. We were talking in our level design and world building sessions about reaction to narrative doesn't necessarily need to be in story. It can be in fact, it's most powerful if it's in world, right? If you start seeing changes to the environment that are a reaction to the kinds of things you're doing in the world, right? If people, want to, things like we've been talking about, like posters going up on the walls, or neighborhoods becoming cleaner or dirtier. If you're doing a lot of crime in the neighborhood and people are moving out, all of a sudden they're like, a lot of the houses are boarded up and there's a lot of trash around. That's a reaction to you, right? And your behavior in the world, which can be very visual and still very narrative, even if it isn't delivered in words. So yeah, I love that point. And actually, I want to maybe jump back up a higher level, because we kind of started to get down into mechanics, and we'll get back to that. But maybe we should start all the way at the top of theme. So take us through what that means to you, and how you think that has such an important impact on the design of a narrative game.
Yes, I love the topic of theme, and I think mastering theme is really the superpower of narrative designers in particular. So, depending on where you come from and how you think about games, you may think gameplay is king, or you may think story is king. But in my world, theme is king, and that is because they all tie together thematically. Theme drives both design and pure narrative, right? So, for example, the difference between a cozy game and a horror game. I work on a lot of horror games,
Uh
right?
huh.
Is a theme.
That's,
It's
that's
either
that's deep insight to you right there. I mean,
yes.
just really that. Yeah.
But for
Yeah.
example, abundance or scarcity, right? Cozy
Okay.
games usually have a theme of abundance. You feel like you have enough, you feel taken care
Hmm.
of.
Right.
Whereas a horror game is scarcity. It's, oh no, do I have enough time? Do I have enough bullets? Is that thing going to get me? And if you understand your theme, my theme is scarcity. I'm in a horror game. These are the horror themes package. And you go, how do I design to scarcity? You have an answer already. Well, you don't have enough bullets. You don't have enough food. There are too many monsters, right? And so mechanically, you can intuit what your mechanics should be in alignment with your theming. Now, that doesn't mean you put story first. I would never really advise that, but it means you understand from the ground up how it's all going to fall together because you're following the flag of theme.
Wow, well, I had never looked at it that way in terms of using the word theme in that context. Because my when I think theme, I think pirates or
Sure.
space, or so I equate theme with setting and character, but I hadn't really thought about it in the context of like mechanically
Hmm.
themed, right? Which is like scarcity versus abundance is a mechanical theme, kind of in that regard. And then designing all about bringing that mechanical theme all into focus and remaining as the kind of core of it is really interesting. Are there other examples of kinds of mechanical themes like that you
Oh, I
really
mean, there
love?
are very many. So, in an earlier game I was working on, we had a theme of wanting to make interactions feel real and personal. It was a very large game, it was a very complex game. There were a lot of NPCs, and we wanted to kind of teach players that in our world, it wasn't the dialogue wheel where you want to go through every dialogue and collect every piece of sentence that every character says. We wanted our conversations to flow like you were having a real interaction with a real person, and then you could kind of flow through it and move on. So we designed to that theme of flow over what we call like collection, right? So dialogue collectors. We wanted to teach the dialogue collectors that you're not collecting dialogue here. Engage in this conversation like you're talking to a real person. And so that went into like, how do we design our UI? How do we trigger the lines? How do we write it in such a way that you don't feel FOMO because you left a line behind, not knowing you
Yeah.
were going to get to it? And what we ended up producing was a dialogue system where it felt like, wow, I'm really kind of jamming with a real person and they're kind of reacting to me. And now we're done with this conversation and we're moving on. And it kind of taught people who especially were into like old role-playing games where you're used to the big dialogue wheel to move through and enjoy it, right? Because we didn't want people to feel stressed that they were engaging in this system. We wanted them to delight in it. And so that was a piece of design that I was rather proud of.
Well, I'd love to dive into that if we can without, getting the lawyers
Yeah,
engaged.
getting in trouble.
But because it's a really good example, right? Because it's really not it's not an easy one to make people feel comfortable to get one line of dialogue and move forward like you do in a conversation, right? Because it's obviously completely unnatural in conversation to say, well, can we roll back a couple of minutes and say, what if I
Mhm.
said this, right? No, it is a one-way street, right? But in a video game with with the ability to have a save and a
Mhm.
replay, there's a real temptation for a lot of players to go back and check every action because they're looking for the optimal play, right? They're
Yes.
looking for that optimal path. So when you started to think about that and that theme of we want this river through it rather than this collection theme,
Mhm.
how did you get the people not to feel like they needed to go back and mine it for more?
So first of all, we made it so that they couldn't. It just was not possible in our
Right.
structure. Second
And,
of
and
all,
then and then how did you not piss them off because it was not possible?
exactly. So we taught I mean, you have to enculturate your player to your game every game that you have. And sometimes you're enculturating against norms in the industry, and sometimes you're enculturating them with norms. But in this case, it was a little bit against norms. And so what we did was, in early conversations, what we did is we kind of underlying structure of the way that you spoke to characters was you get to choose as the player, do I want to talk about you, the NPC, or do I want to talk about me and what I'm doing right now?
Okay. Very
Right.
cool.
And if I
Uh-huh.
engage with talking about you, the NPC, then cool, we can do that. If I want to talk about me, just tell me where the castle is. I'm trying to do this quest. They'll do that. But we basically had switch tracks. So imagine there's like two parallel lines of dialogue, right? Going through this conversation, and you can ping back and forth between talking about yourself and talking about the NPC, and then talking about yourself and talking about the NPC, and then exit whenever you want to. So it feels like when you've gotten enough, you can go whenever you want. So if you don't want to talk to them, actually you can just say a line and get out of there. And if you really want to dig in, then you can spend the whole time there until they're out of lines, and then they're like, "Cool, good to see you. Have a nice day." But at we would give you basically not major inflection points, but minor, conversation driving points to be like, "Okay, we talked about you for a bit. Do you want to switch tracks? Or do you want to keep talking about you?" Right? And when they realized they could just bounce back and forth until they felt satisfied, then it solved the problem of I have to discover every line.
Right. Yeah, because they couldn't go back in time, but they can move forward on a track, and they can forward ping, as you said, ping back and forth. I love that example, and one of the things I really love about it is the choice that you offered the player about their dialogue. Right. So commonly, we have things like, oh, here are five possible lines you could say, or here are five emotional stances you could take. I want to be aggressive. I want to be, subjective. I want to be right. Those kind of things. Which are not very naturalistic, right? If you sit down, I was like, we were invited over to a friend's house for dinner last night, and literally in your head, you're consciously thinking about, I want to ask about them, or do I want to, lead into something that's on my mind, right? And it's a very natural kind of human conversation, right? Mode, and it was a really different way a real different way of empowering the player to make choices. And that's a great example of a structure, right? Of a narrative design, which then produced a very different set of game writing based upon that choice structure. So yeah, that was wonderful. I love that, and just the whole, and also just rethinking because some of it is the semantics, like everything. So, but thinking about the theme of a mechanical theme as opposed to me kind of the fictional theme, right,
Mhm.
is I think, a really powerful way of looking at it. All right, so let's start. Well, actually, I'm going to go before we get down into tools. I think there's also a kind of larger structure thing that is always important to think about. Uh, in screenwriting, they always say show don't tell, right?
Yeah.
The idea that you don't want a person just doing lots of exhibition. You want them to show it on screen. It's a visual medium.
Hmm.
And in games, it's play, don't display, right?
Mhm.
So think, touch on if any thoughts in terms of how you move things because we're so natural. Like, oh, I'm going to have a touch. I'm going to have a cut scene. I'm going to have a big exhibition. I can't say that word right. Exposition. You
Exposition.
know.
Yeah.
Thank you. You know, and how do you get people out of that mindset and get them into the play version of play versions of those things?
Yeah, I mean, I will again appeal to the big brain nature of a holistic narrative design and that it touches everything. Narrative design touches everything. So, for example, in Play Don't Display, there was a character, again, game we won't mention, we were developing who was like a brute. They were like a barbarian, and they, their combat kit was that they charged into things, right? That was their whole thing, but narratively, that character was kind of like emotionally scarred, had some PTSD, was a little bit self annihilating. Like they were in a bad emotional place, right? And what we did was we synthesized those narrative elements and those gameplay elements to make something bigger together. So when that character charged in, they would open themselves up, right? They would shield bash, but then they would be suddenly open. And narratively, it's like, oh, because they don't care if they get hurt, right? Like they're being careless with themselves. And mechanically, it was like you've got to manage your kit. Like, how do you bull around and knock things over without getting knocked on your butt? And so we got to show visually and through the character's actions how she felt about herself as a character while also honoring the spirit of the kit, which is like this is a really reckless warrior. And those things just really, because we thought about it and we thought how those elements could work together, we came up with this really holistic view of like, here's all this stuff comes to this single point.
And that's a great segue into kind of thinking about that the tools of narrative are not just words, right? The most important tools of narrative are gameplay, right? So being able to express insights into the character's personality through their gameplay, like you said, opening themselves up to damage because they had that nihilistic perspective, is a great way to give insight into that, right? The As we've talked about, environmental changes, character behaviors, character, even the way they dress, the way they body language, all of those things are really wonderful ways to express narrative and express feedback to the player, right? That reflective nature of
Mhm.
gameplay. So great example. Yeah, we when we were working on Lamplighters League, right? We definitely wanted to dive into that. We really wanted these characters. We realized that another tool we had was conversation between the characters, not player driven, but NPC, but the characters driven between themselves. So you send two characters, you've sent one character over here and another character then, runs over there next to them and cover, right? You send both characters over there. Boom, you get like two little pop-up things between them where they exchange an exchange of line of dialogue or two among each other. You didn't choose that, but you watched what happened as you did that, right? And because we really wanted the characters to have those kind of evolving senses of relationship to each other, and based upon also how damaged they were, which is something you were kind of in charge of because you were responsible for their psychic health. Yeah, the Watching them bounce off each other, right, really gave you a lot of insights into who they were, and also, is this really a team I want to put together out there on a critical mission? Because they're probably not going to watch out for each other as much as I would like. Uh, Um, so let's kind of broaden it now, kind of coming down the feral funnel and thinking about some of the tools of narrative design. We just kind of reviewed some of those kind of top line. What are some of your favorite ones that you think about? Again, away from the big, you know, AAA games and down into the kind of indie games. What are some of the tools you think are really very cost effective to use, right? And are probably things that maybe not immediately come to new designers' minds.
So, I mean, the basics are economies, world state, and what's the other big one? Um, Character state. Yep. And then progression, right? Uh, and progression is a big box. There's an entire specialty which is progression, but on an indie game, my advice is don't bite off more than you can chew the first time at least.
Right.
Progression is pretty complex. It's actually not my area of specialty. But those are kind of the elements that you think about when you're like, okay, what is this game really? Like, what are we going to do? What is it about? Um, and indie games don't have to be visual novels. They can
Right.
be a number of different kinds of things. They can be puzzlers, they can be
Right.
combat, you can do a roguelike. Those are all really accessible at the level where you have a single developer or a couple of developers together. So it just kind of depends on like, what do you have to say, how do you want to say it, and if you don't know how to answer those questions yet, that's where you start.
Right. And as people are probably getting tired of hearing in the series is think small, right? What's the
Yeah.
smallest game you can make? What's the fewest number of mechanics you have to create, the fewest numbers of characters, the fewest number of environments, right? Do a locker room mystery. It's just like, because it's all about learning the craft at small scale. You're going to learn a lot faster than if you're trying to scope this entire giant thing, and it takes 17 years before anybody can play it. Because you learn by making things that suck, and you're going to
Oh,
make a lot of things
absolutely.
that suck.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it doesn't go away no matter how many years you've been doing it, right? I mean, I'm at 40 years, and the first 10 things I write down are bad. I mean, it's just always, they might be bad in a different way than they were 20 years ago, but they're still not as good as they need to be when we're finished. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, so I wanted to kind of maybe pitch on a little bit. So you used the phrase ludonarrative before,
Yes,
and that's a really big fancy term. They didn't have that when I got in the
I
industry.
know.
Want to break that down for us? I mean, we have been talking about it, but just maybe good to tie some of the things we've been talking about to that actual word.
Yes. Well, if you okay, uh, I suggest you read Johann Huizinga's Homo Ludens if you have an academic bent. But otherwise, what it really means is ludo, right? Means play, uh, and narrative means narrative. So ludo, narrative, play, narrative harmony means, do the gameplay elements and do the narrative elements go together in harmony? Do they resonate? You've heard me say that word a couple of times before. When I say resonance, what I mean is like, does it feel good when they're mixed together, right? It's sort of an intuitive thing. Whereas ludo narrative dissonance, right, is where those things are not meshing and they don't feel good. Now, I want to be really clear. Ludonarrative harmony is not always the state that you are aiming for 100% of the time. Sometimes you want that dissonance because you're trying to accomplish something as a designer that requires ludonarrative dissonance. It's a tool, right? It's a way to look at how things are working. It's not just like ludonarrative harmony is good and ludonarrative dissonance is bad.
So you mentioned that sometimes designers use ludonarrative dissidence intentionally to cause the player to maybe step back or to reflect on something. Is there an example that comes to mind of where you thought that was well used?
Yeah, so I'll go with kind of like an oldie but a goodie that we all know. I mean, at least people of my generation and older. In the original BioShock game,
Hmm.
if you remember in BioShock, there was a phrase that would come up. It would be, "Would you kindly? Would you
Yes.
kindly do this? Would you kindly do
Yes.
that?" And it was basically, it was training you to be triggered because it would always force you to obey at that point mechanically. So the dissonance is like, we are asking you nicely narratively to do this thing, but mechanically we are forcing you, and that
Hmm.
feels bad, man, right? And
Yes.
that's actually the point, and it works really well.
That is a wonderful example, right? Because it is an example. It's if you want to make the player feel like they're in a fascist state, that's a great way to do it on a microcosm, right?
Yeah.
We're pretending that you have a choice, but you don't,
You don't. You
right?
absolutely do not. And so that was a
Wow,
great use of this understanding of these balances to strike home something that made you uncomfortable as a player.
great example. Love that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about kind of anticipating player choices and and how to put the bumpers on a player and the bumpers on a game breath without the player feeling that you have, right? Because no game can be, well, I'm sorry, that's no longer true. We've seen examples of infinite money and infinite time that produce games that have no edges. But
Hmm.
certainly for those of us making small indie games, games certainly have edges.
Hmm.
And just like your bowling lane has gutters, and how do we make sure that the bowling ball doesn't roll into the gutters, right? We put
Yep.
up the safety rails, but how do we make the players not feel like there's safety rails even though there are?
That is the question of game design, right? I mean, at the end of the day, we are illusionists, and our job is to make you feel good about the agency that we present you. um, that does not at all mean, sorry players, close your ears, that you have real agency, right, at any point. The whole point is the feeling of agency. Do you feel validated in your agency? Whether we get there by hook or by crook as designers, it does not matter as long as that feeling works. That's a really important thing to understand and grasp is players will say to the cows come home, I want all the agency. I want to do what I want. And we know for a fact that it's just not true, that it doesn't make a good game. What makes a good game is when those bumpers, right, are intuitive to the player. They understand the bumpers and they know what to do about the bumpers, right? It makes sense to them. And so when we think about small indie games with very limited, right, scope, what we do is we communicate to the player, right? We set player expectations. This is the kind of game it is. This is what you can expect. This is an adventure game, a horror game, whatever it is. It's going to be this long. You're going to get to embody things this way. And the other really important thing is volitional choice. And what I mean by volitional choice is when we give the player a choice, when we actually show them, here's your opportunity for agency, they do understand what that means when they make that choice. So if it's like
Mhm.
between the blue door and the red door, they better understand what it means to choose the blue door or the red door by the time they get there. Or that's a nothing burger. It's a choice that doesn't matter. And if they choose something that they then don't like, that red door killed me and I had no way of knowing that, and that's not cool. Oh, your players will stop immediately. That is the immediate eject button. And so that's what we mean by honoring player agency. It's not being like, do whatever you want in the game. It's like, we're going to make sure you understand your choices so you can choose the experience you want from what you can get from this game.
Yeah, I think excellent examples. The old, classic Lady and the Tiger, right? One,
Mhm.
pick a door. If neither matters, then you've basically said you have no agency, and it doesn't make a difference what choice you make. If
Mhm.
one kills you, one makes you happy, and you had no idea which was which, it's just as bad or maybe even worse, right?
Correct.
So you have to be able to have given the player the agency to learn how to make a good choice. To me, the difference between a game that does that well or a game that has failed at that is after I've made that choice, if it goes wrong, if I felt, damn, I know how to do that better,
Mhm.
right? That's a good game because it means you've armed the player, even if they made a bad choice, you armed them with enough information that they realize the choice that was wrong was theirs, not that it was a random thing, not that they didn't have any agency. And they want to go back and do it, right? Versus if it's just like, well, how the hell was I supposed to know? And now I feel like just been, and it is, I think, as you mentioned, I'll phrase it slightly differently. A game makes a contract between the designer and the player,
Mhm.
and you have to honor that contract, right? You're going to set some limits, and you're trying to make those limits as organic, as natural to the gameplay as you can. And players will test the limits a little bit. They always do. And if the response of that testing is makes sense to them and they understand those constraints, they'll stop testing them. They'll live happily within them. Um, and then when you say you have control over this, you have agency over these aspects of the game, you have to honor that, right? Again, I'll go back to that Game of Thrones one from Telltale. The first chapter of that puts you in control of a little like page character,
Mhm.
a young boy, and as I played through it the first time, at the end of that chapter, he's killed, and I was like, wow, what did I do wrong? And I went back and played it again and played it again, and then started looking it up online, and there is no way to have him survive that first chapter,
Mhm.
and that was for me. That was I was done, right?
Yeah,
Because
because you didn't know that that wasn't a thing you didn't have agency over.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so I assume because you gave me control of a character, I have agency in this character. Their future is going to be based upon the choices I make. And then if
Yes.
you don't honor that, then
They
uh,
violated the contract and you yeeted right out of there.
yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, if you had started that by the kid's in a fortune teller and the fortune teller says looks at his palm and goes, "Yeah, you're dead in a day." Like, okay, now you told me.
Hmm.
I'm now you gave me fair warning, but no, there was none of that. It was just like go
Yes.
forward and become a great knight. Eh,
Right. And the issue isn't solved by not doing it. The issue is solved by communication with the player, right?
exactly, exactly. Communication is the key word, and it is a constant flow of communication between you and the player and the game system, and you've really got to kind of honor that and watch it all the way through as you go. Uh, well, so as you think about these kind of narrative design principles that we've been discussing, is there any kind of closing wisdom for I hate a strange word, but closing advice or wisdom you want to give new designers as they think about making their little indie games? And
I
that was not
mean,
a pejorative. When I said I
no.
wasn't being pejorative by saying little, I'm saying make them small, make them great, but make them small. Yeah.
Um, I mean, there's so much to say, but I think, empathy and curiosity are the cornerstone traits of a good narrative designer. And those are not things you're born with. Those are things that you can cultivate within yourself. And you can pick up and you can play with it anytime. If you design with empathy and curiosity forward first, maybe, you are going to be able to get into the hearts of your players, which is hopefully what we all want. We all want to be able to move people with our art. So please consider being more curious every day, right? Being a little more empathetic every day. And consume art, right? Not just video games, but go to an art gallery, read a novel, watch a Japanese drama, right? Do some Bollywood. The more that you pull in from more places, the more you can kind of gestate on the breadth of humanity, the better games you will make. So engage in a life of art. Games are art. Just call yourself an artist and start engaging with it everywhere that you see it.
Yeah, I love that. I think both curiosity, empathy, absolutely agree. And they're hard. You do have to cultivate them. And consuming art, and you're trying to be in the business of narrative. Consume every form of narrative you can find, right? And some of the ones that I think are incredibly educational in that context are not ones that come to mind. Like, for instance, theme parks are
Hmm.
fantastic for understanding, environmental storytelling, right? And how to build anticipation, and they're really great kind of physical narrative platforms, as are escape rooms, another more easily accessible kind of thing. Really good escape rooms do a brilliant job of kind of you know merge environmental storytelling, narrative, puzzle play, right? And these are great things to learn from. And then as you mentioned, television, movies, um, radio drama, comics. Comics are a really powerful one. One of the things I always have all my designers do is always read Understanding Comics as one of the
Yes,
first
I love that book.
books I always have my designers read, because it doesn't just apply to comics, right? It's the whole concept of how to express narrative and in encapsulated form, which is games are the opposite of writing a novel, right?
Yes.
We get syllables where they get chapters, uh, and so it is so much about it's all about how to communicate story in a very small space, and so well, thank you, Whitney. This has been amazing. I really appreciate your time and your energy and your advice, and look forward to talking soon.
Absolutely. Take care and good luck, everybody.